So hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight from wherever you are. I'm just going to go ahead and get started so that Ben has his full time to share with us his really important work. And first I'll just check the sound. Okay. Ben, would you actually mind muting your mic just for a couple minutes, and maybe that will help. Perfect. How is the sound now, everyone? Okay, I'll try to be very consistent. So again, thank you so much everyone coming out. I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentation with Ben Sichel, and thank you particularly to Ben for all of the work you've put into this already, and I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation. So I just want to quickly introduce myself and my organization, and please feel free to use the chat window in the bottom to introduce yourselves as you join us here this evening. My name is Joanna Dawson, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at Canada's History. And if you aren't familiar with Canada's History, first of all, welcome to our circle. We're a national organization dedicated to making Canadian history engaging and accessible to a general audience. We're perhaps best well known for our publications, Canada's History magazine, formerly The Beaver, as well as our kids magazine, Kayak, Canada's History magazine for kids. We also administer the Governor General's History Awards and have a number of programs and initiatives to support history teachers, students, heritage organizations, and to just generally promote greater popular interest in Canadian history. So I've provided some links there with information to some of our programs, and I encourage you to check them out at your leisure. And I do just want to point one out for a deadline that's coming up shortly. And this is the new Government of Canada History Awards that we just launched this year. And this is a set of awards with opportunities for both students and teachers. Grade 10 and 11 students are encouraged to write an essay response to one of 5 preset challenging questions, and please explore the link there and the questions that have been developed. These have been developed with history educators across Canada, and they really are quite difficult and will get the students thinking critically, and there's a lot of different and interesting ways that we hope that the students take these questions. And we have up to 225 prizes of $1,000 available for students in this program, so please check it out. We also have a teacher portion where high school teachers or teachers are invited to submit their best lesson plans at a high school level related to Aboriginal history, the First World War, or Confederation. And those deadlines are coming up April 18th, so please check out historyawards.ca for more. And I've also provided a link to our newsletters there. That's the best way to stay sort of up to date with everything we do, and we do a lot. So please sign up and keep up to date with some of the things going on. So let's get started. Just a few reminders, just to explain the format. I'm going to pass it over to Ben, and he'll go through his presentation. And we'll leave some time at the end for questions and conversation, and we'll use the chat window there in the bottom right-hand corner. And so please do add your voice to this conversation as well. If you have any trouble with the application with Adobe, you might want to close out some of your other applications if you're finding it slow. If you're on any kind of social media, please continue the conversation there. I've added Ben's Twitter handle as well as ours and our Facebook address, and help us spread the news about what we're doing here. And also, I would like to hear your feedback, questions or comments about the webinar. So I'll be sending a survey to you probably tomorrow morning, and please do shoot me an email or talk to me or call me just to tell me what you thought about tonight's webinar. So finally, let's get started. I'm really happy to introduce our presenter today, Ben Sichel from Prince Albert School in Nova Scotia. Ben teaches grade 10 to 12, and today he'll be talking about some of his work in his Mi'kmaq Studies class. And as we're all going to get a chance to see, he's doing really important work to make Aboriginal history relevant to all of his students and to sort of I guess, open their eyes to the importance of understanding this history. So I'm going to pass it over to you now, Ben, and I can pop your slides up there while you introduce yourself.
Great, thanks everybody. Can you all hear me okay? And I got a yes on the chat window? Okay, great. Thank you for introducing yourselves, and I see some familiar names there, so thanks for coming, friends, those of you who know me. I was going to ask you, first of all, where you were coming in from and what your teaching background is. I see some teachers, some Aboriginal support workers. That's great. This presentation is designed really for, I guess it's kind of a specific need, but here in Nova Scotia, it seems like we have a lot of people who are teaching our Mi'kmaq Studies course who are not Native themselves, and often our students are not Aboriginal either. So it creates an interesting dynamic. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. Also, Joanna may have mentioned it, but after this presentation, it will be available to view online afterwards, the recording. And I have a blog there, which is up on the first slide, called No Need to Raise Your Hand. And I'm going to post the text from my presentation as well as the slides up there shortly. So I'll get started and hopefully not prattle on for too long, and afterwards we'll have some time for questions. So as Joanna said, my name is Ben Sichel, and I'm a teacher of grade 10 Mi'kmaq Studies at Prince Andrew High School in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, which is on territory that the Mi'kmaq people never have ceded. On this territory, I'm a settler, which is a word that I use to mean someone who's not of Aboriginal heritage. And this is just a map of Mi'kmaq, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So I grew up in Moncton, New Brunswick, and in my high school Canadian history class in the mid-90s, I don't remember learning much about Aboriginal people. So human memory being what it is, I can't swear I'm not forgetting something, but all I remember is learning about pre-contact history of Aboriginal people, or what they called prehistory, for about a week, before we got into what was apparently the real meat of the course, which starts with the arrival of the Europeans to North America, of course. Aside from that, the only major mention I can remember about Aboriginal people in school is when an elementary teacher went on a small rant one day, and among other things, she told her impressionable young class that les Indiens paient pas de taxes, or Indians don't pay taxes. So later on, when I did some research on the history of portrayals of Aboriginal people in Canadian curriculum, I learned that my experience in school was pretty typical. So non-Native Canadians have generally learned about Aboriginal people in school as though they were relics of the past, either dead, like the Beothuk of Newfoundland, or declining on the verge of extinction, being steamrolled by the inevitable march of progress, and that's, of course, if we learned about them at all. Now, by the 90s, this portrayal began to change in textbooks and curriculum documents a little bit, and this is all based on some research that I did for a master's degree last year. And a big part of that was due to the Oka crisis. And the Oka crisis kind of woke up a lot of Canada to the fact that Native people were still here, some might say despite Canada's best efforts. We had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples as well in the 90s, and that did an exhaustive job at explaining the root causes of the crisis, along with many of the social problems that are present in Aboriginal communities across Canada today. In schools, some Canadian history texts started to talk about things like treaties, the Indian Act, modern-day issues, and notable Aboriginal people in the present, not just in the past. Now, in practice, this didn't always mean that these topics were done justice in class, but at least people were trying and the materials were there. So today, fast forward to 2014, and every province has integrated some degree of content about Aboriginal people into the curriculum. Now, this varies greatly by province, but many provinces do have a Native Studies class in high school, although I'm not aware of any province where these courses are mandatory for all students. So here in Nova Scotia, where I live, the Mi'kmaq Studies course was rolled out in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and we hoped that Mi'kmaq students would be able to better see themselves represented in the provincial curriculum. So it's important to note that the course in Nova Scotia is something of a political victory. It was fought for by Mi'kmaq people in this province, and it's an important symbol of progress in Aboriginal settler relations in Canada. Today, this course fulfills the Canadian Studies credit in the public school program, so that means that any student can take it if they wish, instead of taking the traditional Canadian history course to get their credit in high school. And in some schools, such as my school, we have a great many students who do choose to take Mi'kmaq Studies. Now, this is interesting because we don't have many students at our school who self-identify as being Aboriginal. So Why do so many students choose to take Mi'kmaq studies? It's impossible to know for sure, but it seems as though, although a few do express an interest in the subject matter, it seems to be something of an open secret, unfortunately, that the course is considered easier among students than the mainstream Eurocentric Canadian history course. And so you can probably see how this is a bit problematic. Why should the history of Aboriginal people be considered lower in some sort of academic hierarchy than the history of white people? We've grappled with this question at my school with no clear-cut answers yet on how to deal with it. But regardless, I still think it's great that so many non-Native students in Nova Scotia are learning in depth about Aboriginal history and culture. Personally, despite the little that I learned about Aboriginal people in public school and even in university, I became quite interested in Indigenous issues in my 20s, I'd say, when I realized through some readings and some experience what a fundamental social justice issue Canada's troubled relationship with Aboriginal people is. And that's not just here, but all throughout the Americas. So I really enjoy teaching the course, but I also realize that me teaching it brings up something of an awkward question, which is, how does a white, non-Indigenous teacher like me teach this course to a group of mostly white, non-Indigenous students in a way that's respectful and culturally appropriate? Now, that's a question that feels impolite in some circles. According to the kind of multicultural liberal thinking that we often espouse in Canada, skin color and background don't matter. We don't see race, we don't see color, we're all Canadian. And therefore anybody could be just as qualified to teach about any subject to anyone else. But, and maybe some of you have studied issues of race and racism, and you might know then that in our society, skin color and background still do matter. We haven't yet attained a magical post-racial society where everyone has equal opportunity in life, and sometimes it even might seem like we're moving backward. Today, Aboriginal people in Canada are still marginalized and stereotyped in colonial society, and their opportunities continue to be limited by the circumstances of their birth. So you can see this in statistics on many indicators of well-being, from health to education, and then of course in tragic individual stories like those of the hundreds of missing and murdered Aboriginal women in Canada. This is the continuing legacy of colonialism and systemic racism in the country. So for this reason, I feel that teaching students about Aboriginal history and contemporary issues is not a responsibility to take lightly. Aboriginal people have been misrepresented for a very long time by settler Canadians. They've been portrayed in stereotypical ways in pop culture and school curricula. And of course, many of us who are teaching this course are steeped in these misrepresentations ourselves. But if you teach the course in the history well, it feels like you can help to reverse some of these stereotypes and improve relationships between Indigenous and settler people in the country. On the other hand, if you do a poor job, you risk entrenching the stereotypes and misunderstandings that students already hold. So there's some pressure when you're teaching this course. Now, there are some people, given the sort of difficulty in teaching the course, who might say that only Aboriginal people should teach Aboriginal studies. And that's a debate within Mi'kmaq communities and within other Aboriginal communities that I've heard. And maybe in an ideal world, I'd like to see Aboriginal individuals who are given sufficient time, energy, resources, and institutional support to teach their history to everyone. But the practical reality in Nova Scotia today is that there are not currently enough Aboriginal teachers here to fill all the teaching positions in their own communities, let alone cover all the Mi'kmaq studies classes in the province. And frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if, given a choice, most Mi'kmaq teachers chose to teach in their own communities and give Mi'kmaq children a chance to see someone of their own culture up front of the class. Also, we should remember that just because someone is Aboriginal doesn't mean they want to teach Aboriginal studies. Maybe they want to teach math or phys ed or art. Also, despite the pressure that Aboriginal teachers can face in teaching about their history and culture, and I forgot to change the slide here, there's another reason that's come to light in terms of why I think it's important for non-Aboriginal people to take on some of the work in teaching about Aboriginal history as well. which is that the average Canadian student holds a lot of misconceptions about Aboriginal culture and history, and those misconceptions can often be aired out in class. So if you're an Aboriginal person in front of the class and you're hearing those misconceptions, it can get kind of personal, and it might not be too much fun to have to do that constantly. So I think it is important for people like me, for settlers whose ancestors were not Indigenous to this land, to do some of the work and to teach other settlers about the history of Aboriginal people. That it should not just be the duty of Aboriginal people to educate non-Aboriginal people about their history and their issues. On the contrary, it is our responsibility to understand how things got to be the way they are and how we can work in partnership with Aboriginal people to make things better. So how do you do that? Well, I have a few concrete suggestions. And the first one, I guess the biggest key point that I find helps in class when teaching of this history is that the history in these classes is so much about relationships. It's about relationships between Aboriginal people and settlers. And I say that because relationships, of course, affect all parties involved. And so when learning about the historical relationships between Aboriginal people and European settlers, we have to remember that for every piece of Aboriginal history, there's a corresponding piece of settler history. For example, learning about how Aboriginal people lost land should also involve learning how settlers took that land. And learning about the ways that Aboriginal people have suffered from the dispossession of that land over the decades should also involve learning about the ways that settlers have profited and continue to this day to profit from that land that was taken. And my father once said to me when we were talking about these issues that Aboriginal land is land that Canada doesn't want yet. So the clearest example of relationships having effects on each party is, of course, the treaty. A treaty is, by definition, something that's signed between two nations or more, and each side gains something by signing, and each side has obligations to the other. Now, today, there are many common misconceptions about treaties, and especially treaty rights. Often, Aboriginal treaty rights, like the right to hunt and fish, under license regimes that are not necessarily the same as those for non-natives, are discussed as if they were special rights or unfair privileges. Have you all heard that before, special rights? Feel free to pipe in every now and then, so I know that you're all alive, but okay, anyway, I'm sure you have. But the way to deal with this, I find, is to, of course, examine what the flip side of those treaties is, right? While Aboriginal people were promised the right to live as they always had done in these treaties, hunting and fishing for sustenance, what did settlers gain from these treaties? And the answer, of course, is land. Settlers got the right to live on the land in peace, to enjoy access to its many resources, and impose their own systems of governance, justice, etc., over the entire area. When a story hits the news about an Aboriginal nation fighting to protect a piece of land, it's most often not mentioned that so much of the surrounding land that was traditionally their territory was gradually encroached upon over decades or centuries. Now, this is maybe a bit of an oversimplification, but I don't think it's very much of one. Graham, I'm not sure I understand your question there. You can maybe repose it now, or if you want to wait till the end, you can do that. It's up to you. Okay, no worries. Yeah, if I'm going too fast, or if you have any questions or comments, feel free to pipe in. I'm the kind of teacher who often, I won't always make you wait till the end. You can just pump in and interrupt if you need to. So in discussing treaties, here in the Maritimes where I live, Aboriginal rights, and here often we hear about the right to hunt and fish outside Canadian licensing regimes, those come from treaties signed in the 1700s. And I'd like to note that those treaties in this part of the country were not cession treaties, which means that the Mi'kmaq and other eastern nations never gave up their legal title to land, which is I mentioned at the beginning. The treaties that were peace treaties, which gave both sides the right to live peacefully together and enjoy the bounty of the land. And the fact that the British signed them recognized the Aboriginal nation status as sovereign nations. So, who gained most from these treaties? And these are the kind of questions that we have to ask in class in order to put this kind of learning in context. Who respected the treaties more? What have been their long-term effects on both sides of nations who signed them? How does learning this history help us understand the situation of both Aboriginal people and settlers in Canada today? So these are the kinds of questions that I think need to be at the forefront of any discussion on Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal issues. So I have a quote here from Tara Williamson, who is a professor at Fleming College in Peterborough, Ontario. And it's from the Decolonization blog. It says, "It wasn't until I became an adult that I first heard the expression, 'We are all treaty people.' Quite frankly, it blew my mind. I mean, of course, I'm a treaty Indian, but it never occurred to me that my neighbors were treaty settlers. But of course, treaties and agreements require at least two parties. How did settlers forget that? How did I forget that? I forgot because colonization and settlement have been normalized. Simultaneously, the depictions of Indigenous peoples as freeloading, angry, on welfare, criminal, and lazy have also been normalized. Truthfully, these two normalizations are the different sides of the same coin. They need each other to exist. As a result, settlers are able to sleep easy with a sense of entitlement to the land and the governance structures that have been placed upon it." So there are some good tools that I've found to help to get students really think from this two-sided coin perspective. And one of them is from a magazine called Briarpatch, which is based in Saskatchewan. And I'll show you it to here. It's called the Settler Treaty Card. Has anyone ever seen this before? Maybe? Yes? No? So this is a fun little thing with some humor to it as well. And I won't read all the fine print at the bottom, but it is pretty good. And the text in the middle says, "With your Settler Treaty Card, you get access to countless privileges that your ancestors' representatives signed on for in perpetuity. Privileges like settler self-government and access to the land." So anyway, this is a nice little trick that I've showed in class that I've got to do little assignments on occasion to bring home the point of the two sides of the treaty relationship. Seeing some folks typing there, wondering if you have questions, or we'll pause for a second. Driving so hard to, yeah, good point. Matt is driving. Wow. I don't know that I knew it was possible to be on a webinar while driving. Audio is bad, huh? Anyone else having problems with the audio? Okay. I'll continue. If it gets incomprehensible, just stop, and I'll have this up in written form as well. Okay. So sort of trick that I've used, a little classroom tool. Oh, and there's my phone ringing, which I will try to ignore. So a little, maybe a standard teacher trick that you might call, "How would you feel if?" And I think teachers might ask this question a lot in social studies and history courses. How would you feel if this happened to you? And so, sorry, my phone was distracting me there. So I asked my students to imagine for a moment that Canada has been invaded and taken over by the United States. And that's maybe not such a far-fetched scenario if climate change makes large swaths of the United States uninhabitable in several decades. And I tell the students that they must now call themselves Americans. Of course, they can privately continue to consider themselves Canadians if they want, but they are now part of the U.S. culture. They have to cheer on U.S. sports teams at the Olympics, the whole thing. Would they accept this? How would they feel? Now, I'm not much of a flag waver in any circumstance, but my favorite part of this exercise is when I play the Star-Spangled Banner, and I ask the students to stand up, and I watch the visceral reaction I get from some of them. It really kind of hits home the idea of what it might like to be colonized. So some other times the two sides of the relationship coin are not as obvious. For example, when we start learning about the Indian Act or residential schools, it's not as easy to just think, well, how did Canada benefit from that? What are we talking about? But I still find, for example, teaching about residential schools is fairly straightforward in a sense, because the students can fairly easily understand the physical and the sexual and emotional abuse that were suffered in the schools and the impact that that's had on Indigenous communities since then. But one thing I find more difficult to teach is the idea of cultural loss. How do you really get students to know what it's like to lose a culture when they can't even begin to conceive of that experience? So one thing I've done once or twice is during the unit, I'll pick a day where as soon as the students come into class for 5 or 10 minutes, I speak in another language for 5 or 10 minutes. And I speak Spanish, so I can do this. But I also put on my best stern teacher persona when this is happening, and once they figure out what's going on, they have a chance to reflect on what it could possibly be like to be thrust with no warning into a place where speaking your language is grounds for scolding or worse. And students have told me that this is an impactful experience. It's a bit risky as a strategy sometimes, but it has worked well, and students have responded well. I've seen some interesting comments there too. Yeah, Mark is asking a good question. Students with prior trauma. I haven't encountered, students have not, I've given students the option always in those difficult circumstances to leave the classroom if they have to. I've warned them beforehand that we are going to be talking about difficult things like residential schools. And I think just the nature of it is that students don't always take you up on that opportunity to leave the class, but a good point, Mark. I think it is important to give students that option. I'm seeing Diane's comment as well. So, it's a careful balance, and yeah, no, it's very good points that people are bringing up, and I thank you for that. So, right there are some specific activities, a few things that I've done in class, but I want to finish off the presentation with some general principles, which I've always found helpful to keep in mind. And I thought of 7. They're in no particular order, and I'll put them up here for you. So first off, I think the first important thing, which might seem obvious, is to strive to bring a diversity of Aboriginal voices into the classroom. So the point of this presentation has been that it's not just Aboriginal people's responsibility to educate folks like me and my students. It is still paramount for their perspectives to be heard. So that can mean using readings or audiovisual materials that privilege Aboriginal voices, and where possible bringing guest speakers into the classroom. Now, for a variety of reasons, it's not always easy to have Indigenous guests come in to speak to a class of non-native students. So if you're having difficulty finding people to speak to students, consider whether there's anything you could do to make it easier, like offer an honorarium, or provide transportation, or take your students on a field trip to hear them. I find all this is easier if you take how important is language in bringing people in. Do you mean how important, Graham, is speaking in the Indigenous language, or I'm not quite sure I get the question. Well, I mean, I think getting students exposed to an Indigenous language can be a very impactful experience if it's done in a way that the students can access. In my part of the country, I found it difficult to find people who speak Mi'kmaq. I've had speakers come in and teach very basic things like hello, thank you, goodbye, which are useful. And I would love to have more of those experiences. I think that the issue is it's really difficult to find people who are comfortable in the language and are have the time and the energy to come in and actually offer that experience. And that actually kind of brings me to the second point that I'm having here. And people are typing furiously, and this is great. I'm eager to see what you guys have to say. But the second thing I wanted to write is to build relationships of trust with Aboriginal people in the local community. And this, I think, is very helpful and important as a teacher, as a non-native teacher who's teaching Aboriginal studies. Given the unequal power relations and the long history of misrepresentation and appropriation of Aboriginal history and culture in Canadian society, it might not be automatic that people would trust you to teach this course. As well, Aboriginal people who are in leadership positions in their communities are often stretched quite thin, trying to work to improve quality of life for their communities. And so coming to speak to a group of non-native students might not be their highest priority. If you cultivate authentic relationships, I find it can help to avoid dynamics where presenters feel like they or their communities are not benefiting from the time you're asking them to give. And And as well, it makes it sort of a safe space for them if the class has not, if they know, if they trust, if stereotypes come out, if students are going to react in a way that could be troubling or insulting, and they know that you'll help debunk those kinds of stereotypes. So building relationships of trust with people is definitely helpful for a teacher. And if you don't know any Aboriginal people personally, showing up at community events where you're welcome is definitely a good way to start building those relationships. The Orenda, interesting suggestion by CM there on the chat window. I have it on my bookshelf. I haven't read it yet, and I've heard controversial, conflicting opinions from different people, different prominent Aboriginal people in Canada. So, very good. Going to go to number 3, which is I've done a presentation on before on this issue specifically, which is that you have to deal with those common stereotypes and misconceptions head on. And I put that on there because sometimes I've known teachers who don't really know how to deal with a lot of those stereotypes, and so they kind of avoid them or shut them down. Now, I don't have a magic technique for dealing with every difficult question that comes up, but you have to know that they will come up, and avoiding them is not an acceptable option in my opinion, and neither is shutting down the conversation. So we need to know as much as we can about these questions. Questions like, taxes, treaty rights, fishing rights, reserves, the fact that there are higher rates of suicide and other social problems on reserves. It's useful if a student asks, for example, or says something about taxes, or some stereotype about Aboriginal people who don't pay taxes. It's of course useful to know the ins and outs of that question. So to know that income tax exemptions are generally limited to status Indians who live and work on our reserve. But it's also useful to be able to put it in context. So to be able to explain why a tax exemption like this exists and how it fits into history, into a series of huge losses and small gains for Aboriginal people. And another point that I got from Thomas King, who's one of my favorite authors, is that lots of other people and lots of other organizations get tax breaks and get exemptions, and many of them cost the public purse many times more than tax breaks given to Aboriginal people are. For example, the oil industry comes to mind, right? I see Graham posted a YouTube, and Graham, I wonder if it's the YouTube clip with Wab Canoe? Yes, okay. So I was just going to mention Wab Canoe has a nice little 2-minute video, and I put a link to it at the end of my presentation as well. It's on some Aboriginal stereotypes. So I really think it's good to learn those things inside and out as well as possible and really place them in context. Number 4 is to pay attention to language, and I mean this in several senses. So, for example, there are many different terms: Aboriginal, First Nations, Native, Indigenous, the name of the specific nation in your area. And so you might be aware of the subtle differences between them and why and when it might be more or less appropriate to use one over the other. And if you're not aware if those things are still confusing, there are resources online that can help you. But there are other subtle things about language that I think it's important to be aware of when teaching about Aboriginal people. And the first example that comes to mind is the word tribe. And I teach African Canadian studies as well, and we talk about the words like tribe and how we use them in reference to African peoples, or how they've traditionally been used. And I get the students to think, well, what do we think of when we say the word tribe? And would we use that if we're describing people with fair skin? Why would we use that word, and why would we not? Can we use any other words? Can we use words like nation? So that's an interesting that can come up. Another word is story, for example. Would we call a story history if it was told or if it was written down by a non-Aboriginal person? When we'd call an Aboriginal history a story. So what are the values we associate with those words? Another example is the kind of us and them language that kind of comes up, especially in the classes I have, where we have usually 0 visible Aboriginal people, maybe 1 or 2 in my classes. But I often have students who, when we'll talk about things, they'll say, well, there are differences between Aboriginal culture and the way that we do things. And so this phrasing, on the one hand, it sets up Aboriginal people as something completely separate, something that's very kind of other. And also, it's impossible to know who's in the classroom and who might feel excluded by that kind of phrase. Um, there are often have students who have some Aboriginal heritage, but who aren't visible and who don't really identify as much. So some of these words you might know are gray areas, and some Aboriginal people use them themselves, but that still doesn't give non-Aboriginal people an excuse not to be aware of them and to understand how these words can carry different meanings depending on context. I hope I'm not going on too long here. I think this is a bit longer than expected, but getting close to the end. So number 5 is don't romanticize and don't essentialize, meaning that we learn a lot of things about culture, but it's important to realize that although Indigenous cultures and spiritualities, for example, are generally centered around land, of course, but that doesn't mean that every Indigenous person you meet has an innate biological knowledge of medicinal plants, or has an alternate traditional name, or engages in their spiritual ceremonies, of course, right? Many Aboriginal people today somewhere between two cultures, and of course there's diversity within communities. And I know I don't have the same values as everybody in my community here in Halifax, so of course I wouldn't expect any different from anybody in the community. Michelle is asking a very good question. Are they able to engage with these students? With these questions thoughtfully, and I think that is the major challenge with this course, is to get students to engage with those questions. And I think that the relationship piece of really getting people to think about their own side of the equation, especially when I talk about settler people, white people, think about, well, what is your side of this equation? You're not just learning about others, you're learning about your own history as well. So I'm going to go to number 6, which is to be respectful of Indigenous knowledge. And this one I find a little complex. Now, in many Aboriginal societies, traditionally, knowledge is not something that you can just go to a library, look up in a book. Knowledge is considered sacred, and it has to be treated with respect, used for the right purposes. And some people with knowledge of Aboriginal spirituality, for example, might be wary of sharing their teachings if they're not sure that they're going to be given the proper respect. So if you are teaching about culture or spirituality, do try hard to know where your knowledge comes from and put it in a proper context. Because otherwise students, if you're not too sure about it, students sometimes will have questions or sometimes say things in ways that are kind of not quite right. They might ask a question and put something in and make a comment that maybe you're not prepared to deal with. So for example, if you see something like this, something that says Native American proverb, I think it's important to be wary of something that says Native American legend or proverb if it doesn't say, well, which nation does it come from? Also, I've found that some sources sometimes contradict each other, which can sometimes be frustrating, and an example of that is, the medicine wheel. The slide got a little funny here. But this is the medicine wheel, which might be familiar to most of you. And there are very different opinions among different Aboriginal scholars and other people about the validity of the medicine wheel. Is it an authentic Aboriginal symbol? So those can be frustrating for a teacher who doesn't know very much and who's trying to figure out, well, what do I teach my kids? But really, knowledge is rarely static in any culture, so I think the best we can do is look for different sources and mention to students that there are differing opinions on issues like that. Mark raises a question: do you often draw parallels with other minority groups? And that is a good question. It's really complicated. Sometimes I think parallels can be valid, but sometimes the position of Aboriginal people is just so unique in Canadian history that there's rarely straightforward questions to that. And of course, all peoples are unique, but we'll have students ask things like, well, there are other minority groups who don't get this and who don't get that. And really, I don't have an easy answer for you. It definitely gets complicated. So my last sort of big suggestion here is be humble and patient. And as we've noted already, so colonialism really completely destroyed or severely weakened the foundations of many Indigenous societies in the Americas. And that's not a small thing. I mean, that's our history, and we're historians, and we have to really understand the effects that that's had today. And it means that today many Indigenous communities are still working hard to find their feet on many levels. And that's in a country where large groups of people are quite unsympathetic to Aboriginal issues, and governments don't provide adequate funding or live up to their treaty obligations. So these are things to keep in mind. If, for example, you're having difficulty connecting with an Indigenous person to come speak to your classroom, or something like that. And I had a quote from a woman named Julia F. Parker, who was a park interpreter for many years in Yosemite National Park in California, and she wrote that, "If I did everything people asked me to, I'd be on the road every day of the year." What else? Yes, Michelle's making a good point as well. Very interesting. So I've heard some people say that, for example, someone was telling me the other day that they were trying to connect with some Aboriginal people, but they encountered some mistrust and some hostility. And I think if that is the case, it's important to understand that Aboriginal people deal every day with undeserved hostility in the form of racism and governments breaking promises and things like that. In my own experience, people that I've asked are generally quite happy to be asked and share their knowledge, and even if they can't make it, they're very gracious about it. So that brings me about to the end. I've gone a little bit long, I'm afraid, and I'm just going to end with a nice quotation that I found. And this is from Chelsea Vowell, who's a Cree and Métis woman in Montreal and one of my favorite writers on Indigenous issues today. And she says, "What it all boils down to is this. Canada has not committed itself to addressing the colonial relationship it still has with Indigenous peoples. Canada is in denial about that relationship. I think it's fair to say that most Canadians believe that that kind of relationship no longer exists. We are trying to tell you that you were wrong." And I think that as non-Indigenous people, it's our responsibility to own up to the fact that these relationships do exist and that we have to take the lead in fixing them. So this is from, sorry Diane, this is from Chelsea Vowell. And here I'll put up the next slide, which has some resources on it. And Chelsea Vowell is I'm sorry, I always have struggled to pronounce the name of her blog, which I know I should really attempt to, because it's really my favorite blog on Indigenous issues. But she's the author of that blog, which is where I got it from. Actually, I think I got this article here as well. The second one on Rabble.ca is also by the same person, and she uses it in that article. So these are some other resources, and again, this is going to be up on the Canada's History website, so you don't have to scramble to write them down now. So, thank you very much for listening, and I've still got time. I don't know what our schedule is like, Joanna, but if anyone has questions, I'm very happy to keep the discussion going as long as folks are interested. See people typing there. Diane, no, it isn't. I mean, I was sort of asked independently by Joanna to do it. I've told my principal that I'm doing it, and my department head, so, and it's public, but no, it's not supported by the HRSP. There's my phone ringing again, which you can probably hear. The board of directors, you mean the school board, the HRSP, Diane? I'm able to offer it to whoever would like to hear it. And I certainly don't ask for any pay or honorarium or anything about it. I'm not getting, want to make that clear that I'm very happy to present on this. Unsettling the settler within. That sounds good. I'm not familiar with Paulette Regan Graham, so thank you for sharing that. I have other resources as well, and when I publish this on my blog, I'm going to include some more. I just kind of ran out of time at the end there, and that's why I didn't list the sources of the pictures, which will also be on my blog. Bad teacher, but yes, I'll be adding some more resources to this list, I think. I didn't even include Marie. Oh, go ahead, Joanna.
No, I was talking earlier and I realized my microphone wasn't working, so I had to reconnect it. So I was just saying thank you, and also we can take these few questions here. And I noticed that Sylvia had one early on that we can go back to as well. But if yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know that I'm still here.
Okay, great. I might have missed Sylvia's question. Let me see if I can scroll back up and find it. Historical thinking. Yeah. Yeah, there is one. I'm familiar with the historical thinking concepts. Sylvia asks, I'll just repeat it. I'm not sure if you're all looking at the same question, but regarding the 6 historical thinking concepts, do you think that we should have one more, which would be inviting ethical engagement? An example of this would be doing social justice actions. I think so. I'm definitely with you on that, Sylvia, and I I think this is where we get into a debate about, can we be quote unquote political in our history? And I think the reality is we're always political in our history, and whether or not we acknowledge that we are not being political, not being what is now thought of as political, is also a political act. And so, the 6 historical thinking concepts. I think we have consider the ethical dimensions is one of them. Maybe the number 6, if I'm not mistaken. And I mean, I certainly think that there's a purpose to us doing this history, and there's a reason that I much prefer to teach Mi'kmaq studies than I do to teach the Canadian history course. See another question coming up. Lens of the resistance movements. I'm with you, Michelle. You know that. Just some disclosure. Michelle works down the hall from me, so I'm very grateful for her presence here and her support and her participation. Thank you, Michelle. I think we agree on most things. That is a good question, Diane. What sparked my interest? I'm trying to think. I mean, I went to university and kind of was interested in social justice issues generally, so I became interested in the environment and interested in sort of international solidarity, and I worked in Latin America for a year and saw that the world was much more than what I knew of it, and then at some point it sort of clicked to me that I was sort of missing this very fundamental issue right here in my own territory, and sort of gradually learned more and more, and a very influential book for me, for example, is Ronald Wright's Stolen Continents, which is up there, and it's a great read, and it really sort of flipped the narrative, and it let me know, oh wow, this is what happened. And then another big thing for me has been that the Thomas King resource that's there, the Truth About Stories. That was 5 of the best hours that I've ever spent listening to lectures on the radio. I really can't recommend those enough. They're 10 years old, 11 years old now, but they're extremely pertinent. He's a wonderful storyteller, and he weaves storytelling and humor with so many interesting things about Indigenous people in the Americas. And it really got me thinking and got me wanting to learn more about these issues. And then, I like many teachers in the public school system, you sort of gradually teach whatever you're asked to teach. And I said, oh, Mi'kmaq Studies, I'll do that, even though I know that at my school and at many schools, Mi'kmaq Studies was sort of the default course given to the newest teacher. And then when we got a newer teacher the next year, it was passed on to them. And I have some friends who are Mi'kmaq in my life, and I think, well, whenever I'm teaching something, I think, would I be comfortable teaching this? I have to sort of live up to what I'm teaching if I'm talking to my friends about how I'm teaching it. So it really pushes me to do better in this kind of thing. So yeah, anyway, I hope that's kind of satisfactory. I see an interesting question from Mark, and here in Nova Scotia, the definitely Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian peoples are the sort of most prominent or best known equity-seeking groups in our province. in some larger centers in Canada, in Toronto and Vancouver, of course, there are much larger racialized immigrant populations, but Nova Scotia has the oldest Indigenous Black communities in Canada from the 1780s, and the history of African Nova Scotian communities has been somewhat similar to those of the American South, and so it's a really complex dynamic sometimes between African Nova Scotian and Mi'kmaq students. I haven't had direct parallels from African Nova Scotian students. Yeah, and that's right. Obviously, a long history together as well with African Nova Scotian and Mi'kmaq students. I more recently started teaching African Canadian Studies, which is the course that most African Canadian students in my school take, rather than Mi'kmaq Studies. And yeah, I don't know. They're kind of interesting. Sometimes it's very interesting because I've had in the past African Nova Scotian students be the ones to sort of vocalize or perpetuate the stereotypes about Indigenous students, which is fascinating. And then you gotta sort of think about how to deal with that. And I've felt like I've gotten a little bit better than that as the years have gone by. But it really depends on the particular circumstance.
I had a question, Ben, and you touched on this a little bit when talking about sort of different worldviews and traditional forms of knowledge. But I'm wondering, how much do you find that you've changed the way you teach when teaching Mi'kmaq studies versus the traditional history course in terms of, your actual methods and the way you present the information?
That's a really interesting question, and I take it you're meaning, like um, there are Indigenous sort of ways of educating and different educational traditions in Indigenous communities. Um, well, it's something that, as a non-Indigenous person, it's hard for me to really feel like I can authentically do that sometimes. There's a very fine line between doing that in a respectful way and doing something that might be considered cultural appropriation. And there's also the sort of external pressures that we have in the school, and which I hear in other schools in our province, which is that this course, like I mentioned, is considered sort of an easy course, right? It's considered the easy alternative that you can take to Canadian history. And so on some level, we're kind of trying to fight that stereotype by saying, no, this is going to be as rigorous a course as the other courses and have the same sort of academic standards. But, of course, what we tend to consider academic standards are, to some degree, Eurocentric academic standards. So it's a fine line. I'm sort of aware of those things and slowly learning about them. Things like a more oral culture and integrating spirituality and integrating, sacred knowledge, but it's really difficult to know how to do that. Yeah. See Alex's comment there. New immigrant students, that's a good point, and it's an interesting dynamic. I take your comment, and really, how can we really expect new immigrants to know much more than that dominant narrative if that's the image that they get from outside, and especially when they come here and they get their immigration documents or like reading materials. And it's an interesting dynamic as well that my partner's told me about. My partner's actually studied Indigenous issues and this very topic of educating non-Indigenous people as well. And she's met a lot of Indigenous people who are also very anti-immigrant, and it's an interesting dynamic, and to some degree, if anyone is going to be quote unquote anti-immigrant, you can understand why Indigenous people would be anti-immigrant in some sense, because we're still their history has been in Washington, and yet they're seeing other people maybe come here and continue to be settled despite that. So yeah, there are definitely tensions, like Alex says, between immigrants and First Nation Inuit and Métis people. Any more questions? I see some typing.
All right.
Some
winding down here. We'll just see if it looked like Alex was typing. But I just want to again thank you, Ben, for all this tremendous work and for the presentation and for everyone else's participation. I find myself fortunate that I get to meet people like Ben, and Sylvia, who was here earlier, is doing tremendous work on residential schools. And I'm so thankful every day that there's people out there working on these important issues. So I just want to thank you again. And as Ben mentioned earlier, we will be posting the recording online. He's provided us with lots of great resources, and he'll put the presentation up on his blog. So, and yes, please do exchange information in the corner there. And if you found us through Twitter tonight, you can send me an email to jdawson@canadashistory.ca. It was at the beginning of the presentation. And that way I can make sure you're on the list to send you the link to the recording and information about our upcoming webinars. We do have 2 more scheduled in April and May. I'll send out that information shortly as well. So thank you again.
Thanks so much Thanks so much for inviting me to participate. And again, thanks to everyone else. I'd love to connect with you all in other contexts and know about any work you're doing, or if you have questions for me, even if they're tough questions. I think the tough questions are the ones we need to ask ourselves and each other. So my email is on the chat window there, a little bit up, and I'm on Twitter, and love to talk about education and these kinds of issues. Alex, is this the same Alex that I know from Halifax? I didn't know you were soon. Anyway, we'll catch up some other time. Thanks for coming.
There you go. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right. Thanks.